Hi there and welcome to this video in the IBM Cloud Foundation Skills Series. In this video we're going to take our first look at IBM Cloud Object Storage. So first of all, let's just define what object storage actually is. Well, at a really high level, it's a cloud native service which is used to store data but in bulk. So unlike other storage services like file and block storage, object storage to the end user is effectively limitless. You can just keep throwing files at it and it never actually fills up. So the individual files that you store are called objects, and these can range from text documents through to multimedia files, through to system backup files or even archives. And when an object is stored, it's actually given some metadata as well, so that's data that's actually about the data, and it's also given a unique identifier. And it's those things that make it actually easier to search for and actually find objects at a later date as well. So when you store an object, they're actually placed in what's called a bucket. Now, buckets have a very flat structure. So for instance, you might call a bucket holiday photos, and into that you'd store all your photos from your holiday, but you can't then add more structure to that bucket by adding sub-buckets called, I don't know, something like summer in France or winter in the mountains, for example. So unlike a file system, object storage has no directory structure beyond the top level bucket. Object storage is accessible from pretty much anywhere, and that's through an API. Though of course you do need the correct permissions to access it, and this is done through tokens that are passed in an API call. You don't actually attach object storage to computers like a disk, though it is possible to kind of view object storage like a disk through a facility called S3FS, and we'll take a bit of a look at that in a later video. So these are a few of the common use cases for object storage. So when you create an object storage bucket, you don't actually define a size for it. With other storage options in IBM Cloud, you do need to define a size. Object storage basically starts off at 0 and it just grows and shrinks as you add and remove data. And basically you just pay for what you use. So this is great when you just want to throw files at it, because you don't have to worry about how large the store is getting or whether you're going to run out of space, because that will never happen. And that's why it's great for storing things like backups and archives. And as I've already mentioned, despite having all this data, it's easy to find things because of the metadata that's actually applied to the objects that you're storing. Now, while it's possible to build static websites using cloud object storage, and by that I mean web pages that don't have any sort of logic behind them, you shouldn't really use object storage where data access performance is important, especially for items that you're frequently accessing. So compared to block and file storage, object storage is extremely slow when it actually comes to data access times. So that said, these are the key features of cloud object storage. So first of all, buckets can be created within a specific storage tier, and we'll look at those in a moment. And you can then use a tier that best suits the needs of the data, and different tiers have different costs. Buckets can also have different resilience types, which can also offer residency as well, and this helps you meet requirements around data protection in terms of availability and where your data is actually stored as well. IBM Cloud Object Storage has a Spira built into it, so if you need to carry out high-speed transfer of either large files or maybe even lots of small files, then a Spira is a really great way to do that. And one other really cool feature of IBM Cloud Object Storage is that it's integrated with a service called SQL Query, which allows you to interrogate delimited data files as though they're actually sitting in a database using SQL queries, and that's really cool. I've already mentioned storage tiers, and when you create an object storage bucket, you associate it with a storage tier. And storage tiers kind of dictate how much you pay to store and retrieve your data as well. So it's worth getting the storage tier right, because once you create a bucket, you can't change its storage tier. You need to create a new bucket and actually move the data. So a quick run through of the storage tiers. First, you have a standard tier, and this essentially provides the highest retrieval performance and is really used where you're likely to access objects frequently. And by frequently, we're talking objects that are accessed several times a month. Next, I've put smart tier. Now, if you're not too sure how frequently your objects are going to be accessed, then this is a good option as the storage and retrieval costs are based around the frequency of access. So your charges will be somewhere between standard and vault, depending on the frequency of access. And I guess that for a lot of customers, this is probably the tier that they tend to go with. Vault is for objects that you know you're not going to access more than once a month, but when you do, you actually want the objects to be retrieved fairly quickly. So this has a lower cost for storage and retrieval than standard, but it's actually a little bit slower to access. And then there's cold vault, and this is for stuff that you would only really access a few times a year. Again, this is cheaper for storage, but retrieval performance, again, is much, much slower. Now, IBM Cloud also offers archive and accelerated archive for object storage, and these are essentially where you're keeping data for, well, I guess archiving purposes, and you don't really expect to need access to it for a very long time. So here the data is taken off main object storage systems, and if you need to read it back, it will be restored to object storage, but that will take up to 12 hours with the archive option and up to 2 hours for the accelerated archive option. So the advantage here is, of course, that you're paying a really small amount to store archive data, but the payoff is that obviously the retrieval times are much, much greater. Now, as well as thinking about your storage tier, when you create a bucket, you also need to think about your resiliency option. And this also plays a little bit into data residency as well. So first we have a single data center, and this is where all the data in your bucket is stored in one location. So this is brilliant if you have strict data residency needs, or you really need fast access to objects from from other storages in the same data center. However, it's not quite as resilient as the other options, because if the service in that data center fails, well, basically you can't access your data. A lot of customers choose regional buckets, and what that means is that objects are stored in at least 3 locations across a region. So if your data residency is good for a region, such as London, Frankfurt, or US South perhaps, this is a much better option than a single data center, because the resiliency is also better too. So more than one location would need to fail for you to actually lose your data. Since you're also accessing the data from different sites, this gives the best performance as well. So all round, this is the best combination for really for price and performance. Lastly, we have cross-regional buckets, and this is where the data is stored in multiple regions. Latency is a bit higher with this option, but if data resilience is top of your list of priorities, then this is your best option, because more than one region would need to fail for you to then actually use your data. So that's object storage in a bit of a nutshell. So remember, object storage is great for storing large amounts of data, which doesn't need to have a structure applied to it or need lightning fast access. So it should really be your first choice for things like for storing things like multimedia files, backups and archives, as well as things like files from Internet of Things devices, for example. Data objects are always stored in buckets, and these are flat in terms of structure. There's no putting buckets in buckets. However, it's easy to find objects because of the metadata that gets stored along with them. And obviously, if you've got a good naming convention for your buckets as well, that always helps. IBM Cloud Object Storage has 4 tiers. So we just talked about standard, the smart, the vault and cold vault tiers. And when you create your bucket, you need to define a tier for it based on how frequently you need to access the objects in it. And again, we just saw how the level of resilience for a bucket is determined by whether it's based in a single data center, across a region, or across multiple regions. And this also feeds into data residency needs as well. Okay, so that's it for this video. In the next one, we're going to go and look at how to create and actually use object storage instances and buckets in IBM Cloud. But in the meantime, check out IBM Cloud at cloud.ibm.com, and I also recommend you check out the official IBM Cloud training from the IBM Center for Cloud Training at ibm.com/training/cloud. Anyhow, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.